Welcome to Inside Communications. I'm your host, Mike Bako. We're often told by Wall Street analysts to have a diversified stock portfolio. But what about a PR firm? How important is it to have diversified clients? Today on Inside Communications, we go inside with Keith Sherman of Keith Sherman and Associates to find out how he diversifies his client base. All that and more coming up next. So Keith, in terms of diversifying your client base, you started out and were known for dealing with Broadway, off-Broadway, certainly had a long run with the Tony Awards, 18 years doing publicity for them. How did you start off doing publicity for Broadway shows? Was that a passion of yours, or did you see it as an avenue that was underserved in some way?
Oh, it's totally from passion. I work completely from the heart. As a young boy growing up in the suburbs of New York, I was the kind of a kid who took a bus to New York on a Wednesday afternoon, cutting classes, going to a matinee and being home before my family knew what I was doing. I was reading Variety when I was 12 years old. And it just flowed from my heart, my degrees in business, marketing particularly, but I ended up hanging lights and being a spear carrier in shows. So it just evolved when I left college and moved to New York. My first job was the marketing director for the Roundabout, which is now a very prestigious Broadway company. But back then it was under a supermarket on 26th Street and 9th Avenue. And things just took off from there. And over the years I've worked on, oh God, 200-300 shows, off Broadway touring. And I made a conscious effort at one point to diversify and proactively reached out to clients in industries that appealed to me, that I had some kind of an emotional connection to, where I thought I could do a good job for them.
So we're hearing a lot about emotion, a lot about passion. Is that something, a lesson to be learned for people out there in terms of if you're going to put in the long hours, if you're going to put in the time and energy to publicize these events, that you really need to have something behind it where your passion is there and not just getting a paycheck from them?
Oh, that's just important in life. I think every one of us can take a lesson from that. We should all work from passion. And I've been very blessed in my professional life to have had some amazing clients that I've worked with over the years.
Let's talk about one of those clients, the Tony Awards, for
Sure.
18 years. Certainly very prestigious. How does that open up doors for you when you're dealing with other shows and other clients to know, okay, I've had this relationship with the Tony Awards for so many years?
Well, you're in the trenches with people. You know, you're working on things. You know, my role was one representing the organizations that run Broadway. So I was coordinating on their behalf with all of the various productions, the television networks, and the media, proactively trying to solicit coverage while at the same time putting out an enormous amount of fires that would present themselves on a daily basis.
How have you moved on to other aspects? Healthcare, movies, working with international clients. Let's specifically focus on movies, working with The Pianist, Far From Heaven, one of my favorites, The Kid Stays in the Picture. How did you make that transition into working publicity for movies?
Well, Focus Features became a client for many years because a dear friend of mine that I started with in the theater was working there, and she brought me in. And it was interesting. It was a movie called Topsy Turvy that I started with.
Sure, Mike Lee.
Yes, exactly. And it was about the opera and theater, and they wanted me to leverage my theater press contacts to get coverage for the movie. Well, not only did I do that, but I far exceeded their expectations by hooking them up with other journalists and just going above and beyond the call of duty. And they said, wow. And they just kept giving me more and more work.
Speaking about getting press coverage, you've worked with many international clients now. As we mentioned, Abu Dhabi, trying to get some of their festival presence here in terms of getting U.S. coverage for an international event. How does that work? It's already hard enough to get U.S. coverage for U.S. events. How about getting U.S. coverage for foreign events?
Well, it's really interesting. The Abu Dhabi Festival, the Montreal Jazz Festival, and a relatively new festival based in Toronto called Luminato are clients of ours. And they each produce in their markets particular programming. And it's our job to shine a light here in America on the efforts there overseas. And we've met with some pretty good results, and it keeps rolling over.
How have you done that? Is it difficult to reach out to a U.S. reporter to cover something so far away? Are you going specifically to that reporter for, that's based for the jazz festival, for the music festival? How are you doing it? How are you getting that international
Well, when you're
coverage?
a publicist, my view is, I can sell snow to Eskimos. That's what we basically are. We're salespeople. So I don't find it to be a difficult thing. That's what I do for a living. It's identifying what's salient, what's important, relevant, and bringing it to an appropriate journalist who would say, that's a good fit for me. If it's a site, if it's a television outlet, if it's a print outlet, just doing the job on behalf of the client.
How have you noticed that outreach changing over the last 2 decades in terms of now needing to reach out to social media people, using social media, reaching out to bloggers? Have you integrated that into your practice?
Absolutely. Social media is really important, but one substantial shift that I've noticed is that years ago you could reach out to a reporter with an idea for a story, and they might do it or not because they thought their readers were interested. I'm finding today a lot of reporters need to have a personal interest in what it is they're covering, or they just say no.
And it goes back to what we spoke about right at the beginning, having that passion and that interest. Is there any times that you can sway the reporter into, showing that you have the passion for a specific client, for a specific event? Does that ever come into play as well?
Absolutely, but ultimately you have to make a good match. You have to know what the reporter's looking for, what the outlet needs, and deliver it to them. Obviously, if you're making that phone call, you think there's something there. And the object is to get to yes.
So let's talk a little bit more about diversifying. We mentioned going from Broadway to movies, some of the international clients. What have you learned from diversifying? Is there something that working with a sports client like Brian Boitano that you would bring to a movie client, to a Broadway client? How do they all commingle at the end of the day?
Well, I think it's important to have a broad perspective in life. And a newspaper has a news section, sports, entertainment, business, and I read them all. And I think it's important for public relations executives to know what's going on in the world at large beyond any particular industry that they're doing, because ultimately it all is intertwined. A lot of the sports that I do is kind of entertainment related. A figure skating national tour or a television special could easily be on the sports page or on the entertainment page if we're trying to bring eyeballs to a television set. When we first started representing the Visiting Nurse Service of New York or Memorial Sloan Kettering for some of their events, it's looking at the elements that the client is trying to promote and figuring out a way to get that into the press. It's the same process, really.
We were speaking about the Tony Awards being right in the heart of Broadway, also right in the heart of Broadway, the New York Marriott Marquis. Synonymous with their New Year's Eve events, great view of everything that goes on in Times Square. What was your relationship like with them, and what specifically did you do with them to get them publicity for some of their New Year's Eve events?
Well, we had a terrific assignment for many years from the New York Marriott Marquis, right in the heart of Times Square. They came to me and said, how do we leverage our position in Times Square with the world's media? How do we get coverage for the hotel? And that's what we did for them. And on one hand, it wasn't hard to arrange for crews to show up and use their location, but the challenge was to make sure that the hotel got the visibility that it wanted. So, from Dick Clark to CNN to other, Letterman and Leno, to make sure that if they were on the space and using that the hotel got some credit for it.
And how do you do that? Is there a branding prerequisite that they need to get in? Is there a shot of the outside of the hotel? Do they need to say live from the Marriott Marquis? How do you deal with these media outlets and say, okay, if we're doing for you, you do for us as well?
It was all of that, and basically just sort of batting your eyelashes and, selling it and making sure that there was an appropriate quid pro quo.
And what was the reaction that they got from it? Not so much from your work, but from the reaction that they got around the globe in terms of their brand recognition.
It was positive. You know, they're there. I mean, they're a major structure right in the heart of Times Square. But they have this amazing 10th floor observation deck that sort of juts out onto Broadway with an amazing view of the crowds and One Times Square and the ball drop. So it was great all the way around.
Keith, thanks for going inside communications with us.
The pleasure is mine. Thanks for having me.